When I think of the incredibly rich complexity of things, I find it impossible not to believe that it was God who brought this about.
Remember, the existence of the earth is not part of God's plan.
Why does all this exist?
Why does the world exist? Why do we exist? Timeless questions. And many people have sought the answers in religion. Yet the world we view with awe also challenges our most cherished beliefs. We struggle through personal crisis, witness horrendous suffering, are challenged by scientific revolutions. Does God exist? We rebel against traditional teachings, demand evidence for our faith, and search again for meaning in it all. Even those who believe God exists generally think such a being can't be perceived with the senses. But nature is tangible. We know the stars are real. Can anything in the universe give us the evidence we may be seeking? Some philosophers have held that God's existence is so obvious that it hardly needs proof. In the Middle Ages, St. Anselm's ontological argument called for the existence of God deduced from the nature of his being.
There is then so truly a being, that which nothing greater can be conceived, that it cannot even be conceived not to exist. And this being, thou art, O Lord our God.
An ontological proof proceeds by showing that the very concept of something entails its existence. According to Anselm, God is by definition the most perfect conceivable being. If God were just an idea, then a more perfect being could be conceived. So, once one accepts the idea of God as the most perfect being, one is logically committed to the existence of God as well.
I doubt very much that anyone in the 20th century is going to be convinced of the existence of God by the ontological argument. First of all, there's a lot of doubt around as to whether God should be conceived as that sort of absolutely necessary being. And secondly, and most important, even if we do conceive of God that way, once you study the argument and see why it's valid, you see that in granting the premise that the existence of such a being is even possible, you've granted everything. And then the question is, why grant that premise?
What if we look for evidence of God in the physical world? Not what we can imagine, like the most perfect being, but what we can actually sense around us. In his Summa Theologica, St. Thomas Aquinas offers 5 proofs to justify God's existence. 1, the cosmological proof, results from the study of the universe. It attempts to prove that there must be either a sufficient reason or a first cause for the existence of the cosmos.
Since there's some controversy about what on earth sufficient reason could be, let me just replace that with the principle of universal explanation. If your car won't start, there's an explanation. If a certain virus is spreading in Eastern Africa, there's an explanation for the fact that it's just started to spread. Things don't just happen. There's always an explanation.
If there were an ultimate explanation for everything that comes about, then what you need is a being which is not capable of coming into being. That's where it connects with the ontological argument. If there is something not capable of coming into being, then that won't fall under the premise everything that comes into being must have a cause.
It is certain and evident to our senses that some things in the world around us are moving. Now, if something is moving, it must have been moved by something else. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover. So, there must be a first mover that is not itself moved. And this first unmoved mover is what we mean by God. Thomas Aquinas.
Back in the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas said that if the universe began to exist, that it would clearly point to a cause beyond itself which was responsible for bringing the universe into existence. But Aquinas, of course, had no way of proving that the universe began to exist. So he always tried to prove the existence of God on the more difficult hypothesis that the universe was eternal in the past.
But current scientific theory suggests that the universe did have a finite beginning some 15 or 20 billion years ago, in an event known as the Big Bang.
Well, the Big Bang Theory is really a startling theory because we see all the clusters of galaxies and the galaxies, which are groups of stars. If you look in every direction, they're all receding from us. And the further they are from us, the faster they're receding. Now, the inference that's drawn from that is that at some time in the past, they were all piled up on top of each other. And they must have, and what we're seeing now is the results of the explosion of this time when all the galaxies are all compacted together. And that this Big Bang, the Big Bang explosion, is when all these, the matter in the galaxies just blew apart. And the mystery is according to current scientific laws, there can be no cause of this original explosion.
The Big Bang Theory offered a paradigm shift in the modern cosmological debate. The universe wasn't a static, eternal, necessarily existing entity, but one with a finite beginning created out of nothing. Why did this universe come to exist?
What the Big Bang model points to is that, in fact, the universe is not eternal in the past, that the universe began to exist, that it came into being out of nothing, and therefore it drops into the lap of the philosopher precisely that missing premise that Thomas Aquinas thought made it obvious that God exists. In order to be a transcendent cause of all matter and energy, space and time themselves, this cause would have to be itself uncaused, timeless, spaceless, and therefore immaterial, changeless, and enormously powerful, which are some of the core attributes of what theists have always meant by God.
But I think that argument has strength at most only so far as it shows that there may be some cause or other of our universe. But to go from there and say it's a God is a big leap. I mean, for all we know, the cause could be a contracting cycle of a previous universe, or it could be a black hole in some other universe that imploded, and our Big Bang explosion is just a result of that black hole.
Big Bang singularity, the initial explosion, was completely unpredictable, with no physical laws to predict its behavior. To some, this is evidence against the Big Bang as being caused by a supreme being.
And so the universe at the very beginning was headed with an enormous probability towards ending up being a completely lifeless universe. And it was the biggest mess possible because all the particles were emitted in completely random states. So you couldn't get a more random, a more disordered state possible. Now why would a all-powerful, all-knowing God want to create this mess and then have to say, look, this mess here, what am I going to do now with this great big mess? I have to fix it up, clean it up, and do this and that just to make sure that so human beings can evolve. That doesn't seem likely what a perfect being would do.
I find the argument that it would be irrational of God to create first an inanimate singularity out of which then an animate universe would evolve to be an enormously implausible and presumptuous objection to theism. It seems to me that God is at liberty to create whatever state of the universe initially he wanted to, and that it may be the fact that God delights in the creative activity of fashioning a beautiful world, beginning with the raw material given in the singularity.
So the Big Bang Theory can fuel both sides of the debate. But what if we look not at how the universe first started, but at the structure of the world? The Greek word for purpose is telos. The teleological or design argument proposes that the intricate order of the cosmos shows that a God designed it with a purpose in mind.
It's a common idea, which then people may have second thoughts about, to be sure, but there's that instinct to say, boy, this is pretty well organized at some level. In some moods, we can see the thing is pretty well organized and extremely complicated, and we can marvel at the structure of a little flower on the desert floor and the delicacy of it and say, golly, that's impressive.
In 1802, theologian William Paley presented one of the best-known expositions of the design proof.
In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew the watch might have always been there. Yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as the stone? For this reason, and for no other, that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose.
The analogy, of course, supported the idea that just as a watch, with all its intricate gears and mechanisms, could not come to be without a watchmaker, neither could such a highly ordered and purposeful world of nature exist without a designer. But Charles Darwin, with his Origin of the Species, published in 1859, came to a strikingly different conclusion.
Now, some people interpret Darwin as overthrowing the premise of Paley's argument. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think Darwin said, yes, there is design. There is design. Paley's right. This is something that requires explanation. He's wrong in supposing that where there is design, there has to be a designer that is a mind, that is a unitary, on-high artificer or intelligence.
Darwin's theory of evolution contends that through a process of natural selection, organisms that can adapt survive, and the rest perish. What was previously thought to be the work of a supreme being was now an evolutionary process. There is a difference between order and purpose. Order is a pattern, a regularity. Purpose implies a plan, a goal. Paley saw purpose in nature. Darwin saw only order.
And so it seemed natural to suppose, well, look at us, we're pretty wonderful. Look at nature, it's pretty wonderful. What made it? Something more wonderful still, the great creator. And that very intuitive and compelling idea has got a million years of tradition behind it, and then along comes Darwin and just turns it upside down and shows how the more complex can come over long periods of time out of a fundamentally mindless process, a just brute, purposeless, mindless process, once self-replication gets going, can produce all these wonders.
On the other hand, the odds against our universe forming as it has are calculated at 1 in 10 billion to the 124th power. Could the whole universe just be a circumstantial happenstance? Or is it reasonable to suppose that God purposefully created the precise conditions for such a long shot to occur.
The actual form of the design argument has been clarified by physicists who point out the amazing fine-tuning of the constants of nature, Planck's constant, gravitational constant. These fundamental physical forces seem to need to be exactly what they are to produce the sort of complex universe we have. So then you say, right, that doesn't prove God. But actually, it means that if there is a God, then the existence of this universe is more probable than it would be if there wasn't a God.
We can suppose that God or the Creator or something wants it to be the case in some sense that this Darwinian process should happen. So in the standard version of this, the Creator dreams of the world, sets up the original conditions for getting Darwinian replication going, and then presses the button and it starts. And all subsidiary evolution of purpose is according to Darwin. I find that first step to be not satisfying at all. A lot of people seem to find some comfort in it. I find it to be even a bizarre exemption.
But what about us? Could blind evolution produce the rational, thinking animals that we are?
I sometimes marvel at people who will say to me, well, I can see how this mindless gradual process could create, say, biological species, all the organs that we observe in animals, plants, but I don't see how it could explain, say, poetry, the products of a human mind. And my response to that is, wait a minute. You think that natural selection can explain a nightingale, but not an ode to a nightingale? You think an ode to a nightingale is that much more wonderful than a nightingale itself? What hubris. If you think that, you don't realize how wonderful a nightingale is. If natural selection can explain a nightingale, it can explain a poem about a nightingale too, I'm sure of that.
The image of a God, a supreme being who crafts not only fragile desert flowers, but humans who can create poetry, is often at odds with the world we experience every day. We know, for instance, that evil things happen in our world. How can evil exist in a world where an all-perfect, powerful being also resides?
If God literally is perfectly morally good, can do anything as God wants to, and knows everything, then this God would be in position to eliminate all the horrors and sufferings that humans have gone through in human history. But this God hasn't. So either this God doesn't exist, or he's not very good. Why is he letting us suffer like this? Why is he letting, just use a dramatic example, why is he sitting there in his heaven watching these people in these boxcars roll off the concentration camps in the 1940s?
It seems to me that most of the traditional answers to the problem of evil don't really add up. People will say, well, evils are educational, that we can grow and profit from them. And of course, some people do grow and profit even from evils such as those. But many people don't. Many people just are destroyed by these experiences. Most of the reasons we can think of are such that they don't weigh in the balance. The goods that God might be expecting to get out of permitting these evils don't weigh in the balance against the horror of their negative value. And so it's almost blasphemous to suppose that we can think of a morally sufficient reason why God would permit them.
I think that part of the difficulty with the suffering and evil that we experience in the world is that many people just implicitly assume that if God exists, then his purpose for us in life is human happiness in this life, that God is basically there to make us happy. But according to Christian theism, at least, this assumption is false. The purpose of life is not human happiness in this life, but rather it is the knowledge of God. And there are many evils and much suffering in the world that I think is utterly pointless with respect to the goal of producing human happiness in this life, but they may not be irrelevant with respect to producing a deeper knowledge of God.
I think if God wanted to leave a sign that he created the universe and existed in it, he would have created some incredibly beautiful universe with exceptionally good moral human beings and like that, rather than this chaos where we have to struggle to survive, and we've gone through years of evolution, animals eating each other, and the horrors of that, and you know, people dying of all these horrible diseases and famines, and those aren't signs of God to me.
I think it would be a great mistake to hold God responsible directly for everything that happens. Supposing that you have a God who wants there to be human responsibility and freedom, the universe has to give you the space for that freedom. So supposing somebody does get killed by an earthquake, you say, did God do that? Well, the answer is, God didn't do that as though God thought, right, this person deserves an earthquake, so I'll do one. But, of course, God set up the planet so that it would obey the general laws of thermodynamics and so on. There are going to be earthquakes, but that is going to happen. Now, how far human responsibility goes, it probably goes further than we think. You don't have to actually, you know, build your cities on earthquakes. But anyway, there we are. Right, there are going to be tragedies, yeah. So it is a tragic universe. I think some people's ideas of God are just a little bit too sentimental. You know? They think, oh, I'll just pray and God will look after me. That ain't true. If there's a God, it's not a sentimental God.
Yeah, I once got a letter from a guy who is both has a PhD in philosophy and is the pastor of the first evangelical covenant church in Lincoln, Nebraska. And he said that he was much taken with the idea that much that goes on in the world is chance from the point of view of pastoral counseling. He said when parishioners come to him after some terrible thing has happened in their lives, quite often, he said, they literally wear themselves out trying to find the meaning of it, trying to find out what God meant by this. But there is nothing in reason or revelation that says that everything that happens in the world has a meaning or is intended by God or is brought about by God.
We lost a son of ours 13 years ago in a mountain climbing accident in Austria when he was 25 years old. He was good at mountain climbing, but on this occasion fell. I don't have any answer to why this happened. I reject most of the answers, as a matter of fact. The answer which says God did it, or these things happen, or something like that, that strikes me as profoundly not true. I think what God wants for each and every human being is that human being flourish until what the Old Testament writers called until they're full of years. And we live with the mystery of why that's not so. I don't have any nice answer to that. I live with the question without the answer.
Many turn to religion seeking the answers, the reassurance so that they may flourish. Some critics believe that the idea of a deity is nothing more than a human concoction offering the comfort we need from reality.
For the individual, life is hard to bear, just as it is for mankind in general. There are the elements, there are diseases, and finally, there is the painful riddle of death. For once before, one has found oneself in a similar state of helplessness, as a small child in relation to one's parents. Man's helplessness remains, and along with it, his longing for his father.
To Immanuel Kant, The existence of a God was necessary to forming a coherent picture of the world. He rejected metaphysical arguments for the existence of God, saying that metaphysical arguments fail because they are merely concepts of our mind. Instead, Kant believed that we must believe in God on the basis of our moral commitments. Morality tells us that good people are rewarded and evil ones are punished. But we know that isn't always the case in the world. So if we believe in morality, we have to believe in some kind of future world where good is eventually rewarded and evil is punished. So morality leads us to believe in a God who can bring about this summum bonum, this perfectly just world. And Kant believed that we have a moral obligation to seek a world where good prospers and evil does not, the kind of world that is achievable only if God exists. Kant disregards any metaphysical claims for a divine being's existence, and perhaps we do as well. But then we look around with a sense of awe as the world rushes upon us. We wonder yet again.
It's not so much arguments, I suppose, the philosopher's sorts of arguments that I find compelling, but just the existential response when I think of the incredibly rich complexity of things, the incredibly complicated workings of things, and then the massiveness of all of it, I find it impossible not to believe that it was God who brought this about. I can try as a philosopher to articulate that carefully in terms of arguments and premises and so forth, but it doesn't arise for me like that. It's an existential response to the experience of the world.
To most world religions, they take this as what is sacred and holy and valuable as something that's totally apart from our universe, something supernatural. Why not take everything that does exist, to take our whole universe as what is most valuable? And why not walk out at night and look up at the stars and feel awe at the stars and the Milky Way and feel awe at human beings and monkeys and everything evolved from animals and from lower life forms, and if you have religious emotions, direct them upon what actually exists. And that seems to me that the proper avenue of feelings like wonder or awe and things like that, rather than directing upon some being whose existence is controversial at best.
What do we see in the heavens above us?